I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists on the heavy oak dining table. I did not throw my glass or scream until my throat was raw. I just sat there, completely frozen, listening to the sharp, piercing echo of my older brother Callum laughing. It was a cruel, full-throated laugh that seemed to bounce off the walls of my own dining room. He had just pointed his manicured finger directly at my 6-year-old daughter Lyra. He pointed right at the small, pale pink hearing aid tucked carefully behind her right ear, and he called it an ugly, defective robot part. I watched in agonizing slow motion as my beautiful little girl shrank down into her chair, her shoulders folding inward as if she were trying to disappear. Her large brown eyes immediately welled up with heavy tears, and her tiny, trembling hands moved frantically to cover her ear, trying to hide the very thing that helped her connect with the world. My heart shattered. I looked across the table at my father, Harlan, desperately expecting him to finally step up, to finally act like the protective grandfather he always pretended to be in public. Instead, he just let out a heavy sigh, waved his hand dismissively in the air, and told me to lighten up, to stop being so incredibly sensitive over a simple joke. A joke. That single word hung in the air above the dinner table, toxic and suffocating. I stayed perfectly quiet, locked in a state of sheer disbelief. But my wife, Maeve, did not stay quiet. She stood up, the legs of her wooden chair scraping loudly and violently against the hardwood floor. She walked straight to the front door, pulled it open wide to the freezing night air, and without speaking a single word of debate, negotiation, or anger, she raised her hand and pointed outside. She showed my family the door. What my enabling parents and my arrogant, golden child brother did not realize as they marched out into the cold, muttering vicious insults about how dramatic and crazy we were being, was that this quiet, unceremonious exit was the absolute end of their comfortable lives as they knew them. By tomorrow morning, my silence would cost them everything they held dear. If you have ever had to shield the innocent people you love from the toxic, relentless behavior of your own blood relatives, you are going to want to hear this entire story. My name is Gideon. I am 38 years old, a fiercely devoted husband to my wife Maeve, and a fiercely protective father to our sweet daughter Lyra. In the grand, complicated, and entirely dysfunctional play of my family dynamic, I have always been cast as the background character. I am the invisible son. I am the guy who fixes the leaky faucets when their plumbing fails, who quietly slips his credit card to the waiter when the dinner checks get too high for them to cover, and who absorbs the subtle, everyday insults thrown my way without ever flinching. People look at me and they see a guy who prefers faded denim jeans, a plain, well-worn gray t-shirt, and scuffed work boots. They look at the small, modest 3-bedroom house I live in, located in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, and they immediately assume I am just a working-class guy barely scraping by paycheck to paycheck. I have always preferred it that way. The truth is, I own a highly specialized supply chain management software company that does business strictly on a business-to-business level. It is not a glamorous industry. It does not put my face on the covers of Forbes or TechCrunch. But it is a company that I built from the ground up with my own blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, and it built a financial foundation strong enough to withstand catastrophic earthquakes. My family, however, never cared about strong foundations. They only cared about the shiny penthouse suites, the brand names, and the superficial appearance of wealth. It was a Saturday, a calm and beautifully quiet morning before the hurricane arrived. The house smelled incredibly comforting, a warm mix of cinnamon and fresh dark roast coffee. Maeve was standing in the kitchen, humming a soft, familiar tune under her breath as she expertly flipped buttermilk pancakes on the griddle. I was standing in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, watching Lyra through the slight crack of the bathroom door. She was standing on her tiptoes, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink, peering intensely into the mirror. Her small, delicate fingers were carefully tracing the outline of the pale pink hearing aid resting behind her ear. We had just gotten it fitted a month ago. She had suffered from a severe ear infection that went undiagnosed for too long, leading to partial hearing loss. We were still deeply entrenched in the fragile, delicate phase where she felt hyper-aware of the device, constantly worried and anxious that the other kids at school would stare at her, point at her, or call her names. She tilted her head to the left, then to the right, inspecting her reflection with a profound, heavy sadness that broke my heart into 1,000 microscopic pieces. I pushed the door open gently and crouched down next to her on the tile floor. I looked her right in the eyes and told her she looked incredibly beautiful. I told her that the pink matched her favorite pair of light-up sneakers perfectly, and that it was not a medical device, but her very own personal superpower that let her hear secret whispers. She looked at me for a long moment, processing my words, and then gave me a small, hesitant smile. She trusted my words completely because she had absolutely no reason not to. That is my most important job in this world as a father. To be the steady, unshakable ground beneath her feet when she feels like she is falling. But as the afternoon slowly approached, I could feel that steady ground being threatened. We were scheduled to host a family dinner that evening. I was not looking forward to it. I never do. Having my parents, Harlan and Delphine, and my older brother, Callum, over to my house is exactly like inviting a destructive tornado into your living room and forcing yourself to sit on the couch and pretend it is just a mild, refreshing spring breeze. You spend the entire time bracing your muscles for the inevitable impact. I spent the entire afternoon frantically cleaning the house, putting away Lyra's stray toys so my mother would not complain about the mess, and trying to mentally prepare myself for the inevitable onslaught of backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive critiques. Maeve could visibly see the heavy tension gathering in my shoulders as I wiped down the kitchen counters for the third time. She walked over, wrapped her arms tightly around my waist from behind, and rested her chin softly on my back. She promised me in a low, serious whisper that if they crossed the line today, we would not just sit there and take it anymore. I nodded silently, desperately hoping it would not come to that. I just wanted a peaceful dinner. I wanted my daughter to feel loved and accepted by her grandparents and her uncle. That was a peaceful Saturday afternoon. But when the doorbell rang loudly at exactly 6 o'clock, and my brother Callum's piercing, arrogant laugh echoed onto the front porch, I knew that peace was about to demand a very heavy price. Callum walked through my front door acting like he owned the entire property. He always did. He is 42 years old, constantly trying to look 10 years younger, and he runs a boutique media and public relations agency that is entirely built on flash, smoke, and mirrors, with absolutely no substantial revenue to back it up. He dresses like he is perpetually heading to an exclusive yacht party in the Hamptons, wearing designer loafers without socks, tailored linen trousers, and a silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off a gold chain. My parents flanked him on either side like loyal, sworn bodyguards protecting a foreign dignitary. My mother, Delphine, immediately started fussing over Callum's expensive cashmere coat, practically snatching it from his hands to make sure it was hung perfectly on the rack so the fine fabric would not wrinkle. My father, Harlan, loudly slapped Callum on the back, roaring with laughter at some mildly offensive joke Callum had just made in the driveway about my neighbor's landscaping. They barely even acknowledged my existence. I was just the unpaid doorman holding the door open to let the real VIPs inside. This blatant favoritism was not new to me. My mind holds a vast, meticulously documented museum of pain when it comes to my family. Every single exhibit in this mental museum is a glaring reminder of exactly where I stand in their hierarchy. The first major exhibit goes all the way back to when I was just 18 years old. I had spent 2 grueling years working backbreaking part-time jobs after school, saving every single penny I could scrounge together. I spent all my weekends covered in thick black grease, sweating in a hot garage to rebuild a beat-up, rusted 1998 Honda sedan that I had bought for cheap from a local scrap yard. It was my absolute pride and joy. I poured my soul into that car. The day I finally got the engine purring perfectly and got the vehicle registered in my name, Callum recklessly crashed his own expensive, brand new sports car that my parents had bought him as a college graduation gift. He was completely uninjured, but the luxury car was totaled. My parents did not even ask me for permission. They simply cornered me in the kitchen and demanded I hand over the keys to my freshly rebuilt sedan so Callum could drive to his dates and his unpaid internship in the city. When I protested, trying to explain how hard I had worked for it, they completely shut me down, calling me incredibly selfish and ungrateful. They lectured me for hours, saying that family always helps family, and that Callum needed reliable transportation for his bright, important future. Defeated, I handed over the keys. 2 short months later, he completely blew the transmission on the highway because he never once bothered to check the oil or maintain it. He left it on the side of the road and my parents bought him another new car. I got nothing. The next painful exhibit in my museum is my college graduation day. I worked tirelessly and graduated at the absolute top of my class with a complex degree in computer science. I had already secured a massive, high-paying job offer at a major tech firm before I even took off my cap and gown. I was incredibly proud of myself. I bought 3 extra premium tickets for the graduation ceremony, deeply hoping that my parents and my brother would be sitting in the front row to see me walk proudly across the stage to receive my diploma. I scanned the massive crowd for an hour. They never showed up. The seats remained empty. They texted me a full hour after the entire ceremony had ended to casually say they had to skip my graduation to attend the lavish launch party for Callum's newest startup venture. A startup that, I might add, spectacularly folded just 3 months later under a crushing mountain of unpaid debt. I stood alone in the empty stadium parking lot, clutching my hard-earned diploma in the pouring rain, realizing in a moment of profound clarity that no matter what I ever achieved in my life, it would always be completely eclipsed by Callum's simply existing and breathing air. But the most recent and infuriating exhibit was happening right now, standing in the middle of my own living room. Callum strutted in, holding a bottle of cheap grocery store wine by the neck like it was a grand, expensive prize he had won in a tournament. He barely said hello to Maeve before he immediately launched into a loud, boasting monologue about his newest, most extravagant purchase. A high-speed recreational boat. He spent 20 agonizing minutes bragging relentlessly about the massive twin outboard engines, the custom-stitched white leather seats, the premium surround sound system, and exactly how much money it cost him. He was throwing around massive numbers in the tens of thousands, puffing his chest out like a proud peacock. He talked endlessly about his supposed massive success in the media industry, his brilliant, unmatched business strategies, and how absolutely everyone in his social circle was desperately jealous of him and wanted to be him. My parents stood there beaming with unfiltered pride. My mother literally clasped her hands together against her chest in pure admiration, hanging onto his every word as if he were a prophet. Have you ever had to bite your lip so hard you tasted blood? Just watching someone who actively destroys your hard work brag like they are a conquering hero? Drop a number 1 in the comments right now if you know exactly how incredibly infuriating that feels. I just stood quietly by the granite kitchen island, gripping my glass of ice water so tightly my knuckles turned white, nodding politely at his ridiculous stories. I knew the absolute truth. I knew exactly what Callum's catastrophic financial situation really looked like behind closed doors because, unbeknownst to any of them, I was the one secretly holding the financial safety net that kept him from drowning. But I kept my mouth firmly shut. I let him have his pathetic moment, foolishly thinking that maybe, just maybe, if he got all the intense bragging out of his system early in the evening, the rest of the night would be somewhat tolerable. Callum bragged loudly about his brand new boat using money that absolutely did not belong to him. And just 10 short minutes later, he aimed his cruel, unforgiving sights on the most precious, vulnerable thing in my entire life. We eventually moved into the dining room. Maeve had truly outdone herself with the cooking. The large table was filled to the brim with beautifully roasted chicken, creamy garlic mashed potatoes, fresh green beans sautéed in butter, and warm, soft dinner rolls fresh from the oven. It was a hearty, delicious meal meant to bring people comfort and warmth. But sitting around that cramped table, the air felt incredibly thick, oppressive, and almost suffocating. The conversation flowed continuously, but it always violently circled back to one central, inescapable gravity point. Callum, my father, Harlan, aggressively cut into his piece of chicken, chewing loudly, and looked down the length of the table at me. He narrowed his eyes and asked, in a tone dripping with blatant condescension, how the little computer repair business was going. I took a slow, deep breath and told him, as I always patiently did, that the supply chain software company was actually doing exceptionally well, and that we had just signed a few major new enterprise clients that week. He gave a short, dismissive nod, chewing with his mouth slightly open. He said that was nice and all, but that I really needed to sit down and talk to Callum about expanding my limited horizons. He passionately declared that Callum was out there in the real world making real waves, networking with the big, important players and taking massive, impressive risks. He pointed his fork at me and told me I was playing my life way too safe, hiding behind a desk in a dark room all day while real men built empires. My mother, Delphine, instantly chimed in, taking a delicate sip of her lemon water. She nodded vigorously, agreeing completely with Harlan. She said it was a terrible shame that I simply did not have Callum's natural drive, his sharp business acumen, or his impeccable sense of style. She looked critically at my plain, comfortable button-down shirt, sighed heavily, and said I could at least try to look somewhat successful, even if I was just working in a boring back office somewhere typing on a keyboard. Underneath the heavy wooden table, I felt Maeve's warm, soft hand slide onto my knee. She squeezed my leg tightly, her thumb gently rubbing a soothing, continuous circle against my jeans. She was physically grounding me, silently reminding me to breathe and keep my temper in check. I focused all my mental energy on the comforting feeling of her hand. I started performing the internal counting trick I had learned years ago to survive my childhood. 1, 2, 3. Keep your face completely blank. 4, 5, 6. Do not engage with their bait. I forced a polite, non-committal hum from my throat and took a slow bite of mashed potatoes. I looked directly at my mother and told her, in a measured tone, that I was perfectly content with my quiet life, and that my chosen work provided absolutely everything my family needed to be happy and secure. Callum laughed at that. It was a sharp, arrogant, barking sound that grated painfully against my eardrums. He sneered, leaning back heavily in his dining chair, swirling his cheap wine in his glass like a connoisseur, and arrogantly stated that being content was just a loser's word for giving up on greatness. He then began offering me a relentless stream of unsolicited, nonsensical business advice. He used empty corporate buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing in the real world. He talked about creating synergy, forcing paradigm shifts, and leveraging disruptive innovation to maximize downstream revenue streams. He sounded exactly like a walking, talking corporate brochure with a massive, fragile ego attached to it. While Callum aggressively rambled on, my attention drifted over to my daughter, Lyra. She was sitting quietly in her booster seat, trying her best to eat her dinner. The room was incredibly loud, with my parents and Callum constantly talking over each other, their voices booming, competing with the loud clinking of heavy silverware and the aggressive scraping of ceramic plates. For someone who is actively adjusting to a brand new hearing aid, chaotic, multi-layered noise environments are completely overwhelming. The small electronic device amplifies absolutely everything indiscriminately, and it takes significant time and practice for the human brain to learn how to properly filter out the harsh background noise and focus on individual voices. I could clearly see the slight, pained furrow in Lyra's tiny brow. She was trying so incredibly hard to follow the fast-paced conversation, turning her head back and forth anxiously, her little brown eyes darting rapidly from face to face. She desperately wanted to be part of the family dynamic. She wanted to engage and be noticed, but the sheer, oppressive volume of their self-absorbed, overlapping chatter was making it physically difficult for her to process anything. I caught her eye from across the table and gave her a slow, reassuring wink. She smiled back at me, a tiny, incredibly brave smile that melted my heart. The air in the room was thick and polluted with their arrogance, but for a brief, fleeting moment, looking at my sweet daughter, I felt a small pocket of genuine peace. I should have known, based on decades of harsh experience, that they would never let that peace last. The miserable dinner was finally winding down. The plates were mostly empty, pushed away to the center of the table, and Maeve had just stood up, wiping her hands on a napkin, to start gathering the dirty dishes. That was the exact moment the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It was abrupt, unprovoked, and utterly brutal. Callum completely stopped talking about his stupid boat for a mere fraction of a second. His cold, calculating eyes drifted lazily across the table, eventually landing squarely on Lyra. She had leaned forward slightly in her chair to reach for a leftover dinner roll, and the bright, warm light from the overhead dining room chandelier perfectly caught the pale pink plastic of her hearing aid, illuminating it clearly against her dark hair. Callum stopped chewing his food. He squinted at her intensely, leaning forward over his plate like he was aggressively inspecting a strange, disgusting bug crawling on the pristine tablecloth. Then, he raised his hand and pointed his index finger directly at the side of her little head. He looked over at me, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips, revealing his teeth. He said, in a loud, booming voice that commanded the entire room, "Hey Gideon, with all that money you save by dressing like a janitor, could you really not afford to buy her something a little more discreet? That thing on her ear is completely hideous. It literally looks like a cheap, ugly, defective robot part stuck to the side of her head. It's a total eyesore." The silence that instantly followed his words was not the normal, quiet kind of silence. It was a complete vacuum. It aggressively sucked every single ounce of oxygen right out of the room. Felt my heart physically stop beating in my chest for a full, terrifying second. I whipped my head to look at Lyra. Her small hand completely froze in mid-air, hovering over the basket of rolls. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost, and then she instantly flushed a deep, embarrassed red. Heavy, hot tears instantly welled up in her big brown eyes, spilling over her cheeks in seconds, and she dropped her hand from the food, bringing it up quickly to cover her ear. She curled into herself, her shoulders shaking, desperately trying to become invisible in her own home. My vision narrowed into a tight, dark tunnel. The edges of the room completely blurred out. The counting trick I relied on evaporated into thin air. The carefully constructed, massive brick wall of tolerance I had built over 38 years of enduring their emotional abuse cracked wide open, shattering into a million pieces. I placed both my hands flat and heavy on the wooden table, pushing myself up slightly. My voice dropped a full octave, coming out incredibly cold, dangerously quiet, and vibrating with a level of pure rage I barely recognized within myself. I stared dead into Callum's eyes and told him to apologize to her right this second. Callum arrogantly rolled his eyes, throwing his hands up, and let out an exaggerated, exasperated sigh as if I were the one ruining the mood. Before he could even formulate a pathetic excuse, my father, Harlan, immediately jumped in to protect his golden boy. Harlan aggressively waved his greasy fork in the air, his face twisted in deep annoyance aimed entirely at me. He raised his voice and said, "Oh, for God's sake, Gideon, calm down and stop making a scene. It is just a joke." He was just making an innocent observation. You really need to lighten up and stop being so incredibly sensitive about absolutely everything. The kid has to learn how to take a joke eventually. The real world won't coddle her. A joke. Calling a vulnerable 6-year-old child's necessary medical device ugly and defective, directly to her face, was considered a funny joke to them. My mother, Delphine, nodded vigorously along in total agreement, murmuring under her breath that Callum obviously meant no harm, that I was severely overreacting, and that I was purposely ruining a perfectly nice family dinner by being so combative. I was completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of their cruelty. My brain was a raging storm of violent, screaming thoughts. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to throw them out by their collars. But before I could move a single muscle, before I could scream the words burning in my throat, Maeve acted. Maeve did not yell. She did not throw a plate. She did not cry. She moved with a terrifying, calculated, and icy precision. She set the heavy stack of ceramic dinner plates down on the table with a firm, loud click that echoed like a gunshot. She walked out from behind her chair, her posture perfectly straight. Her face was an absolute mask of pure, unadulterated ice. She walked right past Callum, completely ignoring his existence, walked past my gaping parents, and went straight to the front door. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled the door open wide, the hinges protesting slightly in the dead, tense quiet of the house. She stood rigidly by the open door, pointing her finger fiercely out into the dark, freezing cold night. She looked directly at my family, her eyes burning with a mother's fury. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the devastating weight of a judge's gavel slamming down in a silent courtroom. "Out!" My father blinked rapidly, looking completely confused and bewildered. He let out a nervous, awkward chuckle, looking back and forth from Maeve to me. He asked what on earth was going on, claiming loudly that Maeve was acting totally crazy and hysterical over nothing. Maeve did not blink. She did not waver an inch. She repeated the word, slightly louder, sharper, cutting through his delusion like a knife. Out, now, get out of our house. Callum stood up violently, his chair tipping over backwards, his face turning bright red with pure indignation. He started shouting, pointing his finger at Maeve, calling her incredibly unreasonable, calling me a pathetic coward for sitting there and letting my wife talk to his family like that. He screamed that they were family and deserved respect. Maeve cut him off instantly, her voice slicing through his tantrum. She told him, staring right into his soul, that real family does not ever bully a little girl in her own home, and that he was entirely unwelcome under our roof. They finally realized she was dead serious. My mother huffed loudly, indignantly grabbing her expensive designer purse, aggressively muttering under her breath about our extreme disrespect and lack of hospitality. Callum aggressively snatched his cashmere coat from the rack, throwing a hateful, venomous glare my way, loudly promising that we would deeply regret this dramatic stunt. My father shook his head in complete, utter disgust as he walked out into the cold, looking back over his shoulder to tell me that I desperately needed to get my house in order and control my wife. They walked out into the freezing wind. Maeve slammed the heavy front door shut behind them, locking the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The house instantly plunged into a deep, ringing silence. Lyra let out a loud, heartbreaking sob, completely hiding her face in her small hands. Maeve rushed over, dropping to her knees, pulling Lyra into her lap, wrapping her arms tightly and protectively around her. Maeve whispered over and over that she was beautiful, that the pink hearing aid was beautiful, and that Uncle Callum was just a mean, foolish, miserable man who did not matter. I stood motionless, staring at the closed wooden door. The very last microscopic shred of obligation, guilt, or loyalty I ever felt toward my parents and my brother dissolved completely into ash. They wanted me to be less sensitive. They told me to lighten up. Fine. Tomorrow morning, they would aggressively learn exactly what total, unfeeling, brutal apathy looked like. Later that night, the house was finally silent and still. Lyra was fast asleep in her bed, completely exhausted by the heavy tears and the emotional trauma of the evening. Maeve was lying in our bed, reading a book under the soft lamplight, giving me the quiet, necessary space she knew I desperately needed to process the explosive anger coursing through my veins. I walked slowly downstairs into the dark living room and stepped quietly into my home office. I turned on the small, brass desk lamp, casting a dim, yellow pool of light over my organized workspace. I sat down heavily in my leather desk chair, opened my laptop, and stared intensely at the glowing screen in front of me. For the past 8 long years, I had been living a highly complex double financial life. When my specialized software company initially took off, it did not just do well. It absolutely exploded in the market. We secured massive government and corporate contracts. I became incredibly wealthy very quickly, far beyond what anyone in my family could ever comprehend. But I knew my family. I knew their insatiable greed and their toxic entitlement. I knew with absolute certainty that if they ever saw the real money, they would ruthlessly bleed me dry, demanding endless funding for every ridiculous, half-baked business scheme and luxurious lifestyle upgrade they felt they inherently deserved. So, I kept my immense wealth completely quiet. I lived comfortably, but far below my actual means, driving normal cars and living in a normal house. But despite their continuous, lifelong mistreatment of me, I had always felt a deeply ingrained, twisted sense of familial duty. They were my blood. So, I secretly used my wealth to build a massive, invisible financial safety net beneath their reckless, chaotic lives. I anonymously set up a massive educational trust fund. Every single month, that anonymous trust automatically paid the exorbitant, sky-high private school tuition for Callum's 2 children. My young niece and nephew attended an elite, prestigious academy purely because of my silent funding, while Callum foolishly spent his own dwindling money on financing sports cars and luxury boats he could not afford. When my parents constantly complained about their rising medical costs, their aging bodies, and their desire for VIP treatment, I quietly contacted a high-end, exclusive asset management firm in the city. I hired Theron, a ruthless, brilliant, and incredibly efficient financial manager. Under the complex guise of a newly formed charitable family foundation, Theron's firm consistently paid for my parents' premium platinum healthcare plans, their exclusive country club memberships, and the expensive leases on their luxury vehicles. They thought they had simply won the lottery with a generous local charity. They had no idea I was the sole donor. And Callum's supposedly successful business? That flashy boutique media agency he was so incredibly proud of? The truth is, 3 years ago he was facing absolute catastrophic bankruptcy. He was days away from losing his house to the bank. Despite everything, I could not stomach the thought of letting my niece and nephew become homeless. So, I instructed Theron to quickly set up a Shadow Angel Investment LLC. That completely anonymous LLC swooped in, bought up all of Callum's toxic debt, and issued him a massive, high-risk business loan to keep his doors open, legally securing 80% of his company's voting shares as collateral. Callum genuinely thought he had brilliantly impressed a mysterious, wealthy group of New York venture capitalists with his charm. He never once suspected that the life-saving money came directly from the quiet brother he openly mocked and despised. I had literally funded their entire delusion of grandeur. I had secretly paid for the very arrogance and entitlement they used to cruelly crush my innocent daughter tonight. I opened my encrypted email client and found Theron's private, direct emergency contact number. I picked up my phone and dialed it. It was well past midnight, but Theron was the exact kind of high-powered professional who answered on the second ring, day or night, no questions asked. His voice came through the speaker, crisp, alert, and strictly professional. He asked if there was an emergency and if everything was all right. I sat back in my chair and stared blankly at the framed photo of Lyra smiling on my desk. I thought about Callum's cruel smirk. I thought about the disgusting word ugly. I thought about the word defective. I thought about my father telling a crying 6-year-old girl to lighten up. I spoke slowly into the receiver, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or emotion. I told Theron clearly and decisively to execute the total financial kill switch on all accounts associated with my family. There was a brief, pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Theron knew the complex family dynamics intimately. He had aggressively warned me for years that I was merely enabling their toxic behavior and that they would never appreciate the sacrifices I was making in the shadows. He asked for verbal confirmation just to be absolutely legally sure. I gave it to him without a second thought. I coldly instructed him to completely dissolve the Educational Trust Fund immediately and place a hard stop block on all pending tuition checks for the private school. I told him to immediately cancel the premium healthcare policies and sever the payments for the country club memberships for Harlan and Delphine. And finally, the killing blow, I told him to officially call in the massive business loan for Callum. According to the strict legal contract Theron had masterfully drafted years ago, if Callum missed a single financial performance metric, the massive loan was payable in full immediately upon demand. Callum had been wildly missing those critical metrics for over 2 years. I had just been mercifully instructing Theron to ignore the breaches. That mercy ended tonight. Theron did not ask why I suddenly changed my mind. He simply replied, with a hint of professional satisfaction in his voice, "Consider it completely done, Gideon. All accounts will be permanently frozen, and the official legal notices and demands for payment will go out at the absolute start of the business day tomorrow morning. They will have nowhere to hide." I thanked him and hung up the phone. I closed the laptop. The quiet, humming sound of the computer fan died away into the darkness. I sat alone in the dim, yellow light of the office, physically feeling the heavy, suffocating knots in my shoulders finally untangle for the first time in my entire adult life. I was no longer the silent, abused foundation desperately holding up a decaying, ungrateful house. I was actively pulling out the load-bearing bricks. I closed my laptop when the clock struck 3 in the morning. Make sure to hit subscribe and drop a like if you are waiting for what I am about to tell you. because tomorrow morning at their house, there will be no sunshine, only a devastating financial storm that will rip their fake lives to shreds. The next morning arrived with a stark, cold clarity. I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. The house was perfectly still, holding its breath after the explosive events of the previous night. I walked into the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool beneath my bare feet, and began my usual Sunday routine. I ground the coffee beans, the loud whirring noise a sharp contrast to the silence, and watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the glass pot. Maeve came downstairs a little while later, wrapping her warm arms around me from behind. We did not speak about the dinner. We did not need to. The decision had been made, the massive gears were already turning in the shadows, and all we had to do now was wait for the inevitable impact. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone began to vibrate on the granite kitchen counter. I stared at the bright screen. It was Callum. I let it ring. The phone buzzed against the stone, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. He called 5 times in the span of 10 minutes. I calmly poured myself a cup of black coffee, took a slow sip, and finally swiped the green button to answer on the 6th attempt. I did not say hello. I just brought the phone to my ear and listened. Callum was breathing heavily, his voice a frantic, high-pitched panic that I had never heard from him before. He demanded to know if the banking systems were down, or if I knew anything about a massive nationwide financial glitch. He was speaking so fast he was tripping over his own words. I asked him in a slow, detached tone what he was talking about. He practically screamed into the receiver. He told me that he had just received a terrifying, humiliating phone call from Sloan. Sloan was the fiercely strict, no-nonsense financial manager at the elite private school his 2 children attended. According to Callum, Sloan had not just called him privately. She had approached him in the massive, crowded main lobby of the school during a special Sunday morning parent breakfast event. In front of dozens of wealthy, influential parents, Sloan had firmly informed Callum that the tuition check for the semester had just been forcefully rejected by the issuing bank. She told him the trust account associated with the payment had been entirely dissolved as of that morning, and that he owed the school an immediate penalty fee of $5,000, plus the full semester tuition in cash, or his children would not be allowed to attend classes on Monday. Callum was hyperventilating on the phone. He told me he had just bragged to those exact same parents yesterday about his brand new, expensive speedboat. Now he was standing in the parking lot, utterly humiliated, trying to figure out why a seemingly flawless trust fund had suddenly vanished into thin air. He begged me to lend him $5,000 immediately just to cover the embarrassing penalty fee and save face. He promised he would pay me back the moment the bank fixed their ridiculous error. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. I looked out the kitchen window at the peaceful, swaying trees in my backyard. I told him that the bank had not made an error. I told him the financial systems were working flawlessly. There was a dead, heavy silence on his end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to comprehend my words. He asked me, his voice trembling slightly, what I meant by that. I kept my voice perfectly flat. I told him that the anonymous educational trust fund had officially withdrawn its financial support. I told him that whoever had been secretly paying for his children's expensive, elite education for the past several years had decided they were finished being generous. I suggested that since he was such a massive success, and since he had just dropped tens of thousands of dollars on a luxury speedboat, he should have zero problem writing a personal check to Sloan to cover his own children's education. Callum started sputtering, his anger quickly replacing his panic. He accused me of being unsupportive, of being a terrible brother for mocking him during a crisis. He screamed that I did not understand how the real world worked. I let him yell until his voice cracked. Then, without raising my voice a single decibel, I told him he needed to figure it out himself, and I hung up the phone. The house returned to its peaceful quiet. The first domino had officially fallen, and it hit the ground with a beautiful, satisfying crash. The peace in my house lasted exactly 45 minutes before the next wave of chaos hit. This time it was my mother, Delphine, calling. I let her call go directly to voicemail. She left a frantic, tearful 3-minute message. I listened to it on speakerphone while Maeve and I cooked eggs for Lyra. My mother's voice was entirely frantic. She explained that she and my father, Harlan, had gone to their exclusive VIP medical clinic for their routine Sunday wellness infusions. When they presented their platinum healthcare cards to the front desk receptionist, the cards were immediately declined. The receptionist informed them, loudly enough for the waiting room to hear, that their premium policy had been forcefully canceled early that morning due to a total withdrawal of funding from the sponsoring charitable foundation. To make matters worse, my father had tried to smooth things over by taking my mother to their elite country club for brunch, only to have his platinum credit card declined at the dining room table. They were humiliated, utterly confused, and entirely convinced that they were victims of massive identity theft. They still had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. They were just flailing in the dark, wondering why their perfect, luxurious world was suddenly falling apart piece by piece. An hour later, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Rowan. Rowan is my older cousin, a lazy, entitled man who has spent his entire adult life riding Callum's coattails, hoping to catch some of the residual wealth. Rowan was the classic flying monkey of the family, always eager to do my parents' bidding and enforce the toxic family rules. I answered the call, leaning back against the kitchen counter. Rowan did not bother with a greeting. He immediately launched into a heavy-handed, self-righteous lecture. He told me that my parents were in total distress and that Callum's business was suddenly facing a catastrophic banking error. He used a tone of voice that implied I was a disobedient child. He told me that as the only family member who was not currently dealing with a massive crisis, it was my inherent duty to step up. He demanded that I go to the bank on Monday morning and take out a second mortgage on my house. He said I needed to hand the cash over to Callum to tide the family over until this ridiculous financial mess was sorted out. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of the request. Rowan was demanding that I risk my own home, the roof over my daughter's head, to save a man who had mocked her mere hours ago. Rowan continued his rant, regurgitating the exact same toxic phrases my parents had used my entire life. He said that family requires immense sacrifice, that we have to stick together, and that I was being incredibly selfish by just sitting safely in my little house while my brother and parents suffered. I let him finish his long, breathless speech. When he finally stopped to take a breath, I spoke. I did not yell. I did not argue with his flawed logic. I simply told him that I was not going to mortgage my house. I told him I was not going to give Callum a single dime. Rowan scoffed loudly into the phone, calling me a pathetic, ungrateful coward. He asked me how I could possibly sleep at night knowing my own flesh and blood was drowning. I smiled, though he could not see it. I told Rowan to deliver a very specific message to my parents and to Callum. I told him to tell them to meet me at the towering financial skyscraper in the center of the downtown district, right on the 50th floor, at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. I told him they needed to ask the receptionist for Theron. I said that if they showed up, I would finally explain to them exactly why they were drowning. And then I ended the call. The downtown financial district was quiet on a Sunday afternoon, but the towering glass and steel skyscraper where Theron operated his asset management firm was always open for top-tier clients. Maeve and I drove downtown, leaving Lyra safely at home with a trusted babysitter. We walked into the grand, marble-floored lobby and took the private elevator straight to the 50th floor. Theron's office was intimidating by design. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city, rich mahogany desks, and an atmosphere of pure, unfiltered power. When Maeve and I walked into the main conference room, Theron was already there, wearing an impeccable tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open, and my family walked in. They looked like they had aged 10 years overnight. Callum was pale, his hair disheveled, nervously clutching a leather briefcase. My father, Harlan, looked deflated, lacking his usual booming confidence. My mother, Delphine, was nervously twisting her expensive rings around her fingers. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me sitting at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, right next to Theron. Callum furrowed his brow, stepping forward aggressively. He demanded to know what I was doing here, in a place like this. He told me to stop playing games and tell him how to fix his bank issues. I gestured for them to sit down. Reluctantly, looking entirely confused, they took their seats on the opposite side of the cold table. Theron stood up. He did not offer them coffee. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply opened a thick, leather-bound folder and pulled out a stack of legally binding documents. Theron looked directly at Callum, his voice sharp and professional. He stated clearly, for everyone in the room to hear, that he represented the anonymous Angel Investment LLC that held the massive, overarching business loan keeping Callum's media agency afloat. He then looked at my parents and stated that he also managed the charitable family foundation that funded their premium healthcare and country club lifestyle. Finally, he mentioned the educational trust fund for Callum's children. My parents looked at Theron with wide, hopeful eyes. My father asked Theron if there had been a terrible administrative mistake, begging him to restore the funding immediately. Theron shook his head slowly. He placed his hands flat on the table and delivered the fatal blow. He told them that there was no mistake. He explained that all of those entities, the LLC, the foundation, and the trust, were entirely funded, owned, and directed by one single benefactor. Theron then turned his head, looked directly at me, and gestured with an open hand. He announced that his client, Gideon, the multimillionaire founder of a highly lucrative enterprise software company, had personally instructed him to sever all financial ties and call in all debts, effective immediately. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. My mother physically gasped, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth. My father's jaw went entirely slack, his eyes darting wildly between me, Theron, and the documents on the table. Callum sat perfectly frozen, staring at me as if I had just morphed into an alien creature. Callum was the first to break the silence. He slammed his fist on the table, yelling that this was a ridiculous, elaborate prank. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was just a lowly IT guy who fixed computers in a basement. He said there was no way I had that kind of wealth. Theron smoothly slid a certified bank statement and the original loan contract across the table. It had my signature clear as day, right next to the massive multi-million-dollar figures. Theron coldly informed Callum that as of this morning, due to repeated, flagrant violations of the revenue metrics outlined in the contract, Callum's business was officially in default. Theron stated that my company now legally owned 80% of Callum's agency, and that we would be liquidating all remaining assets by the end of the week. He looked Callum dead in the eye and told him he was officially bankrupt. My father tried to intervene, his voice shaking. He looked at me, tears welling in his eyes, and said my name softly. He asked how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He said they were my family. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold obsidian table. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and worthless. I looked at the man who had called my innocent daughter ugly just to get a laugh. I told them that I had spent the last 8 years quietly funding their extravagant, fake lives. I told them I paid for the private schools, the luxury doctors, and the failing business because I thought that was what a good son and a good brother was supposed to do. I told them I never asked for a thank you, but I did expect basic human decency. I stared right into Callum's terrified eyes. I told him that yesterday, he used the mouth that I paid to feed, to mock a little girl's disability. I looked at my father and reminded him that he told me to lighten up and take a joke. I stood up from my chair, adjusting my cuffs. I told them that the joke was finally over. I told them they were entirely on their own now. Maeve and I turned around and walked out of the conference room, leaving them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own ruined reality. The fallout was rapid and entirely merciless. Callum, being the deeply narcissistic man that he is, could not handle the quiet, crushing reality of his massive failure. He desperately needed to control the narrative. Later that evening, he logged onto his Facebook account and posted a massive, rambling essay. He played the ultimate tragic victim. He wrote to his hundreds of industry contacts and friends, claiming that his brilliant, thriving company was being hostilely taken over by a ruthless, greedy corporate entity. He heavily implied that his own brother, whom he had supposedly loved and supported for years, had betrayed him and teamed up with the corporate sharks to steal his life's work out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. He painted himself as a hard-working family man being destroyed by immense greed. The comments started rolling in immediately. People were offering him prayers, expressing their outrage, and calling me a monster, even though he had not explicitly used my name. He was basking in the fake sympathy, using it as a shield against his own spectacular incompetence. But Callum made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He forgot about Aunt Imogen. Aunt Imogen is my mother's younger sister. She has always been the fierce, black sheep of the extended family. She is a retired high school principal, sharp as a tack, and she has always seen right through my parents' blatant favoritism and Callum's endless lies. She was the only person in the family who ever treated me with genuine respect. And she was deeply loyal. I had called Aunt Imogen right after the meeting at Theron's office. I told her the entire truth. I told her what Callum had said to Lyra, how my parents had reacted, and what I had subsequently done. Imogen had cried on the phone, not for Callum, but for Lyra. When Imogen saw Callum's pathetic, lying Facebook post, she did not hesitate. She dropped a nuclear bomb in the comment section. Imogen wrote a public comment that was devastatingly precise. She started by stating that the greedy corporate entity Callum was crying about was actually the very same brother who had been secretly paying his massive debts and feeding his children for the past 3 years. She attached a heavily redacted screenshot of the debt collection email from Theron, proving that the loan had been in default for years and was charitably forgiven until now. But Imogen did not stop there. The killing blow was the second picture she attached. It was a beautiful, clear photo I had sent her weeks ago of Lyra, smiling brightly, wearing her pink hearing aid. Imogen wrote, "For all of Callum's professional network to see, your fake, flashy empire was built entirely on the sweat of your brother's back. And you repaid his immense generosity by looking at this sweet 6-year-old girl and calling her medical device ugly and defective. The only thing truly ugly in this family is your rotten character, Callum. You reap exactly what you sow." The impact was instantaneous. The supportive comments on Callum's post abruptly stopped. Then, the tide turned violently. Industry professionals, friends, and extended family members began replying to Imogen's comment, expressing sheer horror and disgust at Callum's behavior, calling out a disabled child is a social death sentence. Within an hour, Callum panicked and deleted the entire post, but the damage was permanently done. Screenshots had already circulated. His reputation, the only thing he truly cared about, was entirely obliterated in the light of the truth. If you have made it this far and you love seeing toxic people face real consequences, drop a W in the comments below. That stands for win. I will personally heart and reply to every single comment with a W in it. 2 days later, the weather mirrored the bleak reality of their situation. A cold, heavy rain poured down relentlessly over the city, turning the streets into slick, gray rivers. It was past 9 o'clock at night. Lyra was upstairs in her warm bed. She had taken off her hearing aid for the night, leaving her in a peaceful, entirely quiet world where the harsh noises of the outside could not reach her. Maeve and I were sitting on the living room sofa, drinking hot tea, enjoying the profound tranquility of our secure home. Suddenly, the motion sensor lights on our driveway flashed on, cutting through the dark sheets of rain. I walked over to the front window and pulled back the curtain slightly. Standing out there in the freezing downpour were my father, my mother, and Callum. They looked pathetic. They did not have umbrellas. Their expensive clothes were entirely soaked, clinging to their shivering bodies. Callum looked like a hollow shell of a man. His shoulders slumped, staring at our heavy front door. My father stepped up to the porch and rang the doorbell. He rang it once, twice, then started knocking heavily on the wood. I did not move to open it. Maeve came up softly beside me, looking out the glass. She did not look angry anymore. She just looked incredibly peaceful. She rested her head on my shoulder. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from my father. "Gideon, please. We are freezing. Open the door. Callum is going to lose his house tomorrow." The bank is foreclosing. Please, son, we need to talk. We are so sorry. I stood there in the warm, dry comfort of my living room, watching them shiver in the cold reality they had created for themselves. I thought about the decades of being pushed aside. I thought about handing over my car keys. I thought about standing alone in the rain at my college graduation. And I thought about Lyra, shrinking into her chair, crying because her own uncle told her she was broken. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I typed a single, brief message back to my father. Lyra is sleeping. She has her hearing aid off, so she is perfectly peaceful. But you are knocking too loudly. Consider Callum's bankruptcy and your ruined reputation just a joke. Dad, lighten up. Do not be so sensitive. I hit send. I watched through the window as my father pulled his phone from his wet pocket. I watched the bright screen illuminate his pale, dripping face as he read the words. I watched his shoulders physically collapse. He showed the screen to my mother, who immediately covered her face and began sobbing into the heavy rain. Callum just stared blankly at the wet pavement. They stood there for another 5 minutes, hoping I would change my mind, hoping the invisible sun would sweep in and save them one last time. But the foundation was gone. Eventually, defeated and thoroughly broken, they turned around, walked back to their car, and drove away into the dark, rainy night. I let the curtain fall back into place, sealing out the cold, and walked back to the sofa to finish my warm tea with my wife. 6 months have passed since that rainy night. The dust has finally settled, and the landscape of my life looks entirely different. The consequences for my family were severe and permanent. Without my secret financial backing, Callum's agency was rapidly liquidated to pay off his massive debts. He lost his expensive cars, his ridiculous speedboat, and eventually his massive house in the suburbs. The last I heard through the family grapevine, he is currently renting a tiny, cramped apartment and working a miserable entry-level sales job at a regional paper supply company. His massive ego has been entirely crushed under the weight of reality. My parents, Harlan and Delphine, had to drastically alter their lifestyle. Without the charitable foundation covering their VIP bills, they had to cancel their country club memberships and switch to standard public healthcare clinics. They were forced to sell their large, empty house and downsize to a modest, practical condo on the outskirts of the city. They take the public bus now instead of leasing luxury sedans. They are finally living the exact same ordinary, working-class life they used to mock me for. They have tried to reach out a few times, sending hollow apology cards on holidays, desperately trying to reestablish a connection. I return every single letter unopened. In my own home, the change has been incredibly beautiful. With the toxic weight of my family finally removed from our lives, we are thriving. Lyra has blossomed. She no longer tries to hide her hearing aid. In fact, just last week, she proudly marched into her first-grade classroom and showed all her friends the sparkly, brightly colored stickers she had carefully applied to the pink plastic. She is confident, happy, and entirely secure in the knowledge that she is fiercely loved and protected. As for the immense wealth that I used to waste on saving people who hated me, I found a much better use for it. Maeve and I took the exact monthly amounts we used to spend on Callum's tuition and my parents' luxury bills, and we officially established a genuine charitable foundation. Our foundation now provides high-quality hearing aids, speech therapy, and medical support to underprivileged children whose families cannot afford the expensive equipment. We are using the money to build children up, rather than using it to enable toxic, arrogant adults. It is the best investment I have ever made. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the sheer magnitude of what happened. Some extended relatives, the flying monkeys who still hover on the periphery, have called me cold-blooded and ruthless. They say I pushed my own flesh and blood into absolute financial ruin over a single stupid comment at a dinner table. They say I should have been the bigger person and given them a second chance to learn. But I always remind myself of this profound truth. A single, cruel comment from a grown man is more than enough to permanently shatter the fragile soul of a 6-year-old child. The financial ruin they faced was simply the exact, fair price of admission for their lifelong cruelty. So, I turn to you, the listeners who have stayed with me through this entire journey. Many people tell me I am a monster for not forgiving my family, for letting them lose their homes and their pride when I had the power to stop it. Tell me honestly in the comments below. Am I wrong for refusing to give them a second chance? Should I have compromised and accepted their apologies to keep the family intact? Or did they get exactly the brutal reality check they deserved? Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. If you felt any connection to what Maeve and I did to protect our daughter, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to stand up to toxic family members. Do not forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. I will see you all in the next video.